Good afternoon. I don't know how many people have had their lunch, because if they have, then the sleeping insomniac bit is a problematic thing after Indian lunch. I think all of us have resisted that. I'm just a moderator, so I think the big bosses are here. And I want to be at the side because everybody privately wrote to me saying that it's slightly awkward and complicated topic. So they want to talk about the topic through their experiences as a practicing artist. So I completely agree with you. So what we will do is each one will present their points of view, and then we'll take the provocations further. So I think Shashi was the first one to write to me. I think Shashi.
Good afternoon. I hope I don't make your sleep worse or better, whichever you choose. The subject is ethics, and ethics by itself is boring unless you make it personal. So let me start with a story. Let me start with a story, if I may. My basic ethics, I started thinking about ethics in college, where we did three things with work. We tried to wriggle out of it, we tried to evade it, and then we tried to postpone it. This continued throughout my college years. And when I started working, I discovered the hard way that I had to change. And I'm going to talk about how that change happened. My first job was with a consultancy organization, where one of the things we had to do was collate large amounts of data. We had these huge sheets of paper with numbers written across them and all the way down that we had to analyze. And most of it seemed to be very boring. It used to be like the land, irrigated land, the crop yields and stuff like that. I found it immensely boring. And I happened to say this to my boss. He was my supervisor at the time. And he asked me, what have you seen in the data? And I said, nothing, things are increasing, irrigation is increasing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I tried to bluff my way through. So he said, let's have a look at the numbers. So we sat down with a few of those sheets and went through them, and I discovered that I'd been wrong. My guesses were all wrong. He'd caught me lying. And he told me so. He didn't do anything else. But then he made it clear that I hadn't done the right thing. And that was when I started thinking a little more seriously about hard work, about not wriggling out of it, about not evading it, about not postponing it. What makes this especially personal is that the person who did this, my supervisor of those days, is in the audience right now. I won't embarrass him by naming him or pointing him out, but let me also say that I'm very grateful to him for doing what he did, because that set me thinking about what's good and what's not, what's appropriate and what's not, and what's right and what's not. So I've been doing this throughout. It's an immensely personal. Every time I write a book, I think about whether I'm doing the right thing. Like, for instance, when I wrote a satire on India's political system, in which I suggested that the letters BJP might also stand for blowjob paradise, for instance. But each time I do something like that, I think about whether it's right, whether it's appropriate, whether it's fitting. And I haven't been able to develop a set of rules to define my sense of ethics. It's just a sharpening sense of, like I said, what's appropriate. That's the most important thing in my writing. I really haven't been able to put it in words, but the most important thing is something that emerged from an email that Marta wrote. The idea is to do whatever you're doing responsibly. That's the most important thing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Responsibility. When I was 20 years old, I didn't feel responsible for anything in this world. And I was afraid being a writer. So I studied history, and I became a specialist of medieval history of Western Europe. And I did some bigger works than in the end my PhD work, and I was always feeling kind of uncomfortable with it. I was realizing that I'm not a good historian. And why? Because I always had the tendency to invent things. Because the past was not perfect. The past was something that I wanted to change, which is not a good base for an historian. And after I realized that, I realized I had too much fantasy, which the people said to me during my whole life, since I was a little child. I always hated the word fantasy, because every time I came somewhere, they said, yeah, that's that guy with the fantasy. For me, it was a fantasy. Until now, I'm greatly disturbed by my own fantasy. And my first books were full of energy and fantasy and talent. But when I look at them now, they had all of this, but they are not very good books. They didn't have what Shashi said, the responsibility. They didn't have the thing that you learn in life, that the things that you do have an effect on other people. So for me, the writing career, I mean, it's an absurd word, career, for the way we as writers fight ourselves through life, was a possibility to get to a point that I am more responsible now in picking up the topics, in thinking, can I hurt someone? I always, I learned a lot when I was 28. One of the most ugly persons of Austria, the boss of a company that made bio products, but it was completely fake bio products. He made he went to a tribunal against one text that I published because I let him speak to a slave that he had with that always had to have his mouth on his stick, things like that, and he was saying fascist things. And in that moment, I thought it's possible to make jokes like this. Now, as a 50-year-old oldie, I say, well, it was big fun, but maybe it was not a big fun for this fascist. So he might be right. My text had to be put out of the internet, and sometimes I look back on the text and it's really funny. But in the same time, it's not funny at all. And I wouldn't do that anymore. And I think we all should learn that we change in life, and that we come to other points where we look back on our own person, and we can say, I'm different now. I think that's very important. And for me, the ethics, thinking of how should I write something? Should I write it? Should I say that that Austrians' new prime minister has a secret homosexual life in public or not? Is it, I have that knowledge, but is it of any use? Is it political, what kind of political question is it? Should we make, should we say everything that we know? I think this is very important. The responsibility that we have when we say something in public is a big responsibility, because we change things. We change things in bringing them into the world. And this, to have this responsibility, distinguishes us from all the other people who make fake news, knowing that something is not the case and saying it is the case. After 20 years in journalism, I prefer, in journalism and in literature, I prefer to say things that are the case. I prefer to stick with reality and truth, and in the end to stick with moral. Yes, and I got moralistic in the last years, and lots of people now use this term as a negative term, and they say, yeah, you are you from the left, you are the moralists. And I can only answer them, we from the left, I don't even know from where I am, but I am moralist, and I will stick to that. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Before I start asking a question about ethics and responsibility, I would like to say that it is a great pleasure for me to be invited to the festival and to have such opportunity to discuss very important topic as responsibility, ethics. And for me, as a writer of fiction and non-fiction and documentary filmmakers, it is a really big issue how to be responsible, because if you write non-fiction, you have to deal with the real people, real facts, and people trusted you. And the first rule I am trying to follow is to do not harm your protagonists. Do not harm the real people who decided to share with you their personal stories. And it is, of course, a question how our work can change reality. And we should be aware of the fact that it is a kind of power that we can change somebody's life. Our work can have a big impact of somebody's life, and we should protect the vulnerable and do not harm people. And the second thing I would like to mention is responsibility for the audience, for the readers. Because I think that personally, I do not want that my books or my movies would provoke any hate speech, any violence. I should be aware of that and think before my book will be published or my film is going to be released. I should think about how it could influence the reality. Yeah.
I think ethics means different things to different people. And even the sense of responsibility changes with each generation. As an old timer, I think I have a very strong view about ethics, but I find a lot of it has changed. Maybe I am stuck in a time period, a time warp, but the thing is that the definition itself keeps changing. Today, what is ethical may not be ethical tomorrow, and what was ethical yesterday may not be today. So I belong to a defense family, and I think as a defense spouse and a defense daughter, I have had very strong sense of responsibility and ethics. And I'll just quote one example. I have done several history books. They're fiction, but based on history, the Mughal period mainly. And I have been offered, very tempting and tantalizing amounts to do web series and things like that. But I couldn't take them up because at some point of time I found my views conflicting with the people who were involved. I strongly believe that you have the responsibility of let history be as it was, not give it any color or change. Because often we find that what was historically true has been changed for some, political reasons or whatever. And I think as writers, we have to understand the ethics of being writers. Like Marta said, we have a responsibility to the readers, and we do have to consider the changes that we can make through our writings, because we do influence a lot of people. And that, to my sense of morality, is very high. The concern between, a writer's responsibility and the ethics being there. And I think as writers, we are aware of it. And I would say that at least I have tried to maintain that point of view.
Listening to all of you, I feel completely outnumbered because I feel I am very irresponsible and very unethical. And I'll explain why. The topic itself was something like drawing the line at inspiration. Now, if you think about it very carefully, if we actually draw the line at the inspirational point, we will not move forward with our fantasies, with our creative spaces, and so on. There won't be any edginess, there won't be any boundaries to break, and so on. So at a personal level, if as artists and writers, we are not irresponsible with what all the, good and the bad is an important thing to have a sort of polarized. If it's polarized, it's a problematic thing. What you eventually choose to put out in public, that's a different thing. So there's a private thing and a public thing. At a private level, when you're creating work, I find it fairly useful to be completely free, including, do all sorts of things. Of course, we don't harm people and so on. So that's one thing I would like you to talk about, because everybody said such holy things, and I was just wondering, how are creative people so proper? Perhaps you're on stage, but we are in a community of creative writers, and I hope you will expand on that a bit more. I like your. I know you're a very humorous writer. Having read your bio itself, I knew your sort of satirical strain is very strong, and the BJP was not very well, but very happily disguised as something else. I want you to talk about, since you are from India and you are from India, I'll take up something as before, how writings and facts are being revised in textbooks, for instance. Novels are being re-edited by the powers to be. Who's controlling who? Perhaps you can take that up?
Yeah.
The first one is, of course, are we supposed to be guarded?
Let me rephrase this bit about responsibility. As a writer, I think my responsibility is to myself, not to the audience, not to anyone. So whatever I believe true, if it is satirical, so be it. If it provokes, I wouldn't like it to provoke violence and so on and so forth. I don't think we are capable, I don't think I'm capable of writing anything that will provoke violence. But my primary responsibility is to myself. I need to be honest. And if there's an edge to my writing, so be it. If it makes people uncomfortable, they are perfectly free not to read what I write. In that sense, the reader has the ultimate choice between yes and no. So, to expand on what he was saying about creative spaces, for me personally, I write whatever I like, and then I go through it and check if I'm being honest to myself. If I find that I've done this, not that I'm always honest. I've violated my own senses many times, but the older I get and the more I write, the closer I get. It's an inward process, and the closer I get to my own sense of what is fitting. That's why I said I can't codify this thing of ethics. It's something very personal. It's something that comes through. It's something that emerges from inside, and it is very much a part of the creative process. Since you were asking about that, it's not something that I impose externally. You know, it's not like a sort of built-in editor that says, no, don't use bad language, don't say nasty things about people. There's nothing like that. It's just an innate sense of what is good and what is not. I stick to that.
Anybody else has a thought on this? Marta, perhaps?
I just want to add that, yeah, of course, creativity, feeling freedom when you are create fiction, it is really important, and make people uncomfortable. Yes, I would like to make readers uncomfortable, because I want to them ask themselves questions after reading my books or watching my movies. I think that it is really important to provoke a kind of discussion, but it is something different to provoke discussion and deep conversation than to provoke hate speech or violence.
No, I think we're speaking about 2 or 3 different things at the same time. For example, when I write a travel story, I always try to concentrate. Martin, don't invent the people. Speak with the people and then write about them, but don't make literature out of it. And when, for example, Marta makes a documentary, of course, she has to do with real people and cannot hurt their feelings and cannot use them. This is what you wanted to say in the first thing. But all of us, if we write a novel, of course, we can do whatever we want. But of course, there are the ethics we are talking about.
Actually, yes, I agree with Sudeep. Creativity does not know boundaries. And perhaps that is the reason I stick to fiction more than I stick to nonfiction. I tried nonfiction. In fact, one of the books I wrote was about Saddam Hussein. And it was really funny because I felt so strongly about the invasion of Iraq, and I wanted to take out all my anger. So I sort of wrote that book, The Death of a Dictator. It started when he was captured and hung, Saddam Hussein. And that was just a way to take out my frustration, but then I stuck to facts. But then somewhere down the line, I realized dealing with facts is going to be more difficult. It's easier to do fiction. And I let my creativity be unleashed. So I was not restricted by the sense of responsibility in some senses. And the the ethics, of course, remain. But then like Shashi said, your ethics and morality senses are actually within you. You draw your own lines, you have your own limits. So it is for you to feel comfortable as a writer or as a person. And it's just about that. It's about honesty and being true to yourself, like you said. So to me, that is the most important.
Tell me something. Say if you take the other arts, say classical music or dance, classical music perhaps much more, certainly Indian classical music, you're told, even art, say fine arts, you're told to copy your masters when you're an apprentice. And it's a really big, important learning process. Certainly, so say poetry, some of my finest mentors forced me to write in form, write a sonnet. Sitting in Delhi sonnet was probably very irrelevant, Write a canzone or a villanelle. They're hard things to do. But the thing was, they said, if you're going to write modern, contemporary literature or writing, how do you even break the form if you do not know the rules or the original forms? How do you experiment so that classical training becomes important? The trick, of course, is there are certain people who will copy, and never really go beyond that. and come very close to this dreaded word called plagiarism. And it happens repeatedly in popular culture. A lot of the Hindi songs are complete rip-offs of English songs and so on, and everywhere else, you know. How do you deal with that sort of thing? Because, for instance, if I'm inspired, and often I read a writer and I'm completely agog with their work, and it makes me think about something that I want to create. With poetry, there is a mechanism. You use maybe 2 lines as an epigraph and say where it's from, and then your poetry starts. It's very clear that that is the takeoff point. Or if you're in fact really quoting something, it will be in italics within the poems. So the original source is very clearly indicated. How do you balance originality and commonality? How do you balance inspiration and plagiarism?
It's like this. For me as a writer, every good book that I read influences my writing. Every good book that I read, in some way or other, it leaves its impact. And the hardest thing about writing is working at it over and over again until you find what is your own voice. And now, I'm now doing my 15th book, I think. And even now, I struggle to find my voice. We can present this as an ethical question, but it comes down to, like for instance, let me name authors. I respect people like Hemingway, people like Steinbeck, and people like Martin Cruz-Smith and Stephen Hunter, all sorts of people. All of them have influenced my writing. But it's up to me to look beyond all that and find my own voice. And to be completely honest, I managed to do that only with my 14th book. So if I were to write an honest acknowledgement to everyone who contributed to my first 13 books, I would have to list out every single author whose books I liked. And I have no way of doing that, actually. But that's how it works. There's no way I can acknowledge that. The only thing I can say is that if at all we stand tall, it's because we stand on the shoulders of giants, or whatever it is. Yeah.
No, but let's touch on this aspect of plagiarism, because that is something that I was asked definitely to talk about, because it's an issue in the contemporary art space and the writing space and so on. We have so many examples. People have been caught lifting texts from classics or very old literatures and plonking them into their book and losing book contracts and so on. How do you even, where do you balance things in sense?
Well, I never stole anything, but I remixed it. I remixed it. I'm a DJ of my own brain, so sometimes people say to me, "Yeah, but that's not new. You have this from here and there," and I tend to say, "No, I never read that in my life." And then at home at night, I think, "Wow, Martin, you're such a sinister guy. You were not aware of this." But of course, as I told you, my fantasy is so maniacally mad, I'm not able to really make plagiat. How do you say that in English? Plagiarism. I'm not able to make a complete plagiarism. From time to time, I well, not half, but maybe a tenth of it might be from somewhere else. But I think this happens to all of us. I mean, we read, and this goes in here and out there, and then you hear something from a good friend. He tells you a story, and then 2 years later he reads it in your book. You have already forgotten where it came from, and he says, "Oh, Martin, you shouldn't have." And I said, "Yeah, but I didn't mention your name," and things like that. It's our daily business, and I grow older, and I tend to forget who tells me what, and in the end, it's all voices in my writings. Yeah, how should we do it? I can only do it my way.
Well, Martin is very humorous, and age is clearly protecting him, because age is not an excuse for not remembering or something. I'm being provocative because certainly you keep notes and so on. You have to cross-check, and as a journalist, you have to do all that. So it's not about so much forgetting. I know you're pulling people's leg, but real plagiarism, it's remix is a good word, actually, because you've really contemporized the whole thing. You listen to songs.
In fact, yes. I was just about to
Go
say,
ahead.
Bollywood has made a business of remix. So we are not the first ones. Martin isn't the first one to do it.
But remix, when you say remix, is it actually original lines straight from other sources, and then you would sandwich and realign it? Or are you talking about, take that. Yeah.
Never, because I would never remember an original line for very long.
It's a good excuse, yes. Right, okay. Okay, age is we should respect age, yes.
Yeah, of course, I feel the same as Martin. Our contemporary culture is a culture of remix. It is really difficult to discover something new. And for me, as a writer of fiction and non-fiction, it is a completely different mechanism when I'm working on fiction, and I am totally free, and I use my imagination and I use my intuition. Yeah, I try to follow my intuition, and the work as a non-fiction, it is much more harder, because you need to verify the facts, you need to ask real people questions, and you cannot just imagine how the real people live, how they feel. You have to be strict to the rules and follow the reality.
What about this wonderful new genre which is very popular now in America, of course, which is creative nonfiction, which gives writers a lot of space to invent, at the same time not make the work journalistic. There are many very fine examples of creative nonfiction. What's your take on that? Because that is really where your ethics kind of start pricking you, what to push and not to push, and what is real and what is not real, because all those books are sold under the non-fiction shelves ultimately, not under the fiction shelves. So there, how do you calibrate this
It's
text?
a blend of fact and fiction, like Martin said, remix.
Ethically.
Ethically, I just wrote I think it's one of the first climate fictions thrillers in our country. The one that I have just written. Means I was very aware of the weather changes, and I started thinking in terms of the kind of things that are happening around us. And then I realized a plain, dry book may not interest or draw in that many readers. And that is the reason I sort of, turned it into a thriller. Because there's a worldwide kind of concern now with this girl, going around and, fighting for the realities that are happening around the world, Greta. Yeah. So, to me, I think that was a little bit of a blend of facts and fiction, because I did do a lot of research, and there are a lot of quotes which are, factual happenings. And then I blended it with fiction so that it would interest the average reader. Now that would, I don't know whether that would figure in the genre that you are talking about, but basically you tend to, blend the two things and create your own stuff. So that's like taking the license with the truth and at the same time sticking to the truth.
So Amitabh Ghosh would be very happy with you, because he publicly on many occasions has said that not any of enough fiction writers or no fiction writers are not taking on the responsibility of Anthropocene, climate change and so on. And if that's the case, that's a wonderful thing, because in poetry certainly there's lots of examples of ecology and climate change, but most people don't read poetry, unfortunately. We have now, this is suddenly flashed up, this LCD screen telling us that only that many minutes are left. And that's very, very important, I think, for everybody to participate. We have about 13 minutes and 2 seconds. Shall we open it up for questions? Yes, the gentleman there. Just introduce yourself in one line and then address the question to any one specific speaker if you can.
That's difficult, because there's so much of creative responsibility here. It's that'll become irresponsible if I say that my question is addressed to a particular individual. My name is Ramendra Kumar. I'm a writer of children's fiction. I have 2 sessions. I hope you people come to that. But most important is what you said was remixes. Sorry, that's pejorative. It is creative inspiration. Never say what Honey Singh or Basha is doing is remixes. I can't tell this to Martin because of his age, he'll forget, but this is creative inspiration. Now, there's one thing which we talked about, responsibility. I basically feel responsibility and freedom, as the cliche goes. My freedom ends where somebody else's cheek begins. So do you agree to that? Yes. At your age, yeah, okay.
Well, I mean, you can't be more precise than that.
Yeah,
The
absolutely.
gentleman-
Age shows.
Yeah. The gentleman just behind him.
My name is Dr. Kranti Tarasco, and I have spent about 50 years studying information systems, and basically that's enough background. There's a lot of, so I've troubled with all these questions,
Yeah.
and I thank you all and thank for arranging such topic. But let me get to my important question. Is first of all, I feel, and again with all due respect, literary work is fantastic. I am obsessed with it now after attending this. But I think the question we are discussing can also be more easily discussed as a general question of ethics in general. And let me say the title that I would have for that panel. It would be, should an individual's ethical norms and values be controlled by the society and any of its institutions? This is the topic we are discussing from my perspective. Now, I also have a tentative answer, so I'm subjecting myself to hopefully scrutiny by you and anybody here. I feel, again, ethics fundamentally by its very definition, ethics is something that is for the individual, and this is reflected in many of your own comments. Ethics is for the individual, and it is paradoxical, it's almost contradictory to immediately start talking about legislating it through society and its institutions. This is my problem with this whole topic since I became an adult, unfortunately.
Do you mind asking a very pointed question, perhaps?
Okay, well,
and someone can respond?
Yeah,
Thank you.
to stick to your format, I will ask it to each and every one of you. I want to follow the format. I'm an information scientist and a system scientist, so I respect the structure. Important thing is, can we talk for even a short time about, and this discussion is fantastic. I'm almost high with listening to everything.
Fantastic.
And so I'm not against.
I think, thank you, panelists. You've done a great job.
And I am not at all. I'm all against suppressing such discussions before you start imagining that.
Yeah.
I am saying that at the end of the day, we will never succeed in trying to control an individual's ethical norms and values. Society can keep doing this.
Just a quick question would be great.
So do you agree, or to what is the alternative?
Thank you very much for such a feedback. I wish I could answer a question about the definition of ethics, but I think I won't be able to, even if I would try to do in my mother tongue Polish. It is really difficult, but yeah, it is difficult. Maybe you will try.
Yeah, she gives it back to me because I gave it to her. It's the most difficult question, but we're really feeling very touched that you got so high, that you were able to ask a question like this.
I think I'll agree with Martin. I will rather keep myself down to earth, not get too high, and not try to answer that because it would take a lot of time, and we are really running short of time. So maybe someone else has a question.
Yeah, the young man here. Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Rajiv Menon. I really enjoyed the conversation about how sometimes creativity knows no bounds, you cross boundaries. So what does apology look like? Or how do you sort of address when you feel like you've crossed a boundary or maybe gone too far into that space?
There's always an editor holding you back, asking all kinds of awkward questions. So in my personal experience, I've never been, I wish I'd been in legal trouble because then I'd be much more famous. But then that's never happened, which is probably a pity. But there are several stages at which people catch you, and publishing houses have legal departments and so on to make sure. Failing that, if you make a blooper that gets past all this stuff, I suppose you sell your house and pay off the damages. That's about all that happens. Thank you very much.
But you know, the negative side to it are things like, say, if you take an example of a wonderful historian, Romila Thapa, you know, or Wendy Doniger, you know, whose books get banned or pulped by incredibly important publishing houses purely because the government has changed. I mean, what are we talking about ethics then, you know, top down, and who has the power and who doesn't have the power? So,
I don't think any of us would like to be in Taslima Nasreen's shoes and be banned from the country and be, you know, hunted with you know.
you know, Taslima Nasreen's case is also very curious because if you read the Bangla original, which I read, I mean, that's the original language she wrote it in, it wasn't that provocative in any sense. It doesn't even take that kind of stance, which kind of created that whole furor. When it was translated into English, even the translations were all right. You know, it wasn't even misrepresented. What happened was it was politicized by the two religious lobbies and the two countries, Bangladesh and India. And then, of course, it helped her as a writer because then she traveled around and, you know, everything happened. But you wouldn't want to be in that kind of shoes. I mean, if someone is thinking in fantastical terms like Rushdie, and you know what happened to that. But in Argentina or in Latin America, it was okay because the norms there were such that you could write magic realism. So it's about format. So if it's travel writing, as Martin was saying, you have a stricture within which you operate. If it's fiction is the place, I suppose, any kind of creative writing, you can take a lot of space. But unfortunately, there are rules for every little channel you pursue.
I think to answer the question, normally I was always right when I was writing the things, but in the few cases that I was wrong, of course, it's obvious that you publicly say sorry, and that you personally, if someone writes to you, that you concede that you were wrong. You cannot do another thing, and you cannot always be right. Even for me, it was impossible. So,
I would just remember the beginning of the session said the perceptives change, the perspectives change. So it changes with time. What is wrong for you may not be wrong for the other person. What is right for you may not be right for another person. So now in the current political scenario, in fact, people have to be very careful, I think, whatever is going around. So things keep changing. And I think a writer sort of has to tread cautiously between the lines.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Abbas, I'm a writer. This question is to all of the panelists. There's a really cool line in literature called Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins. What do you guys think about it?
Can you repeat that again?
Loudly? So there's this really cool line in literature from the old days called Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins. What does each of you think of that line?
Yeah, but that line, particularly, she wants to respond to the line. The panelists couldn't quite hear it. If you were clear and perhaps ask a question, exactly what you want us to say.
Yeah, I just want to know that that line, Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins. What does each of you think about that line as a literary whatever? And do you think it would stand today as popular literature?
Yes, yes, yes. I think it's a beautiful line. It's very, very. Yes, yeah. Fire of the loins, yeah, yes, yes. I think it's a very, very beautiful line. It's in one phrase, you have two kinds of polarities that are oppositional. It's beautifully phrased. A lot of people may be unhappy with that kind of positioning, but the fact is, there are so many different readerships and so many kinds of viewerships. Each one comes with his own kind of coloration. So, but as a piece of text, I think it's a very beautiful, beautiful sentence, phrase. That's my opinion, and I wouldn't want to take any sides, really.
It's like this. This is a line that makes me uncomfortable. But I must also say that it's out of discomfort that my best work comes. That's what gives you this is the kind of thing that gives you the edge that makes you question yourself. To that extent, it's a very useful thing. Thank you.
Yeah, it's an interesting sentence, and it. Yeah, it makes you. It's so important to have a first sentence that makes the people read the second sentence, because the people want to stop when you give them a book. After 3 or 4 lines, they want to have a pizza, they want to go to the city center, want to meet somebody, or they check their cell phone if there's a message on Messenger or WhatsApp, and you fight against it. You fight so much against it as a writer.
Yeah, I agree. The first sentence is the most important, and it's like a trigger that pushes you to the second sentence and to the whole book.
Yeah, I think, writers spend much more time thinking about the opening sentence than they do about the entire plot. To that extent, yes.
Okay, one last question. We have 13 seconds.
Hi. I feel that if a writer is not able to write what he feels, then how can he tell to his own soul that, like, for example, beef. Now, in some states, writing on beef is allowed. In some states, writing on beef, is a very too big deal. So, how to draw the line, and who actually tells about ethics and
I think this was answered variously at various points, that each one has their own viewpoint as to what to say and what not to say. And please.
In trucks and all, you have heard of the governor, speed governor. So a writer is actually bound by self-governor, and that is the only thing that dictates his writing.
And actually, at the end, I have to sort of probably thank you all for a lovely session, and thank you for being a wonderful audience. But let us also put this across that writers, in some senses, if you want to publish a book, you don't have that much of a choice. Ultimately, the publisher decides how to package it. It's bound in a book form. There are certain kinds of blurbs that are written in a way that it's marketed. So it's already, in a sense, colored. But on that note, thank you very, very much.